nCloth is one of those very cool tools that it's not just for clothing. You can use it for lots of things. In past classes, we've used it for stuff like flags and little drapery type things. Now, a couple things about it. It has to be polygons. A NURB surface can't be turned into nCloth. You can turn a NURB surface into polygons and then the polygon into nCloth, but you can't go right into that. So I'm going to start off with just any polygon object. And you'll see that it doesn't have to be a flat object either. So like this sphere, I can make this an nCloth object and it'll fall down and interact and do all this cool stuff. So FX, nCloth, and then create nCloth. And then I need my guide here so I can see everything. Show all. Close that. Good. Okay. So just like the hair one that I showed, you get a nucleus. The nucleus is what's going to be driving all the dynamics and physics in the system. If the nucleus goes away, everything stops. Okay? If we delete history, everything stops. So we don't want to delete nucleus or delete history on our objects after they've gone into dynamic mode. Okay? So just to see what it looks like with default settings, macro time. It's just going to fall and it's going to go straight through. There's no ground. Obviously, I need to turn the ground on. So I can say for the nucleus, use plane, just like in bullet, it's going to make a fake ground. But unlike bullet, we actually get some options to play with. Okay, so there's my nCloth, sphere. And then we can turn things up like bounciness and turn things down like friction, which is nice. Okay. Now in this case, there's not a whole lot there because the weight of the nCloth is just so heavy, it just falls straight down. So if I go to the nCloth and I start playing with, start playing with some of these settings, this is where we can really control what this nCloth is looking like. Okay. So don't look at nCloth as like physical cloth. Look at it as soft objects. Okay. So this could also be like a balloon. Okay. Or it could be a bounce house. Or it could be a piece of paper. Or it could be a whatever. So if I take my compression resistance up, and these are going to be a little confusing because it's not compression, it's compression resistance. So it's resisting compression. The higher the number, the less likely it is to compress. Okay, so now you see it didn't compress as much as it did before. Same thing with stretch resistance. It actually has good at 20, but just in case it's stretching a little bit, it's kind of not stretching as much now. If I crank these numbers way down, you'll see that you get some weird results. Okay. Now these also can be animated too. So if I were to pull this up now and hit play, there we go. It's a pizza. Okay. Now that's actually not how I would do that, but just so you can see, these can be animated to adjust to things. So some of these, I'm not going to give you all the definitions. Again, use the help files to research them and look them up. That way you create more of a connection than just hearing it from me. But certain things like stretch resistance, compression resistance are important ones, obviously, because you're going to use those a lot. Just like hair, there's an input mesh attract. So on the hair, we had an input curve attract. This has an input mesh attract. And if I say, at 1, you'll see that there's no movement. Right now, it's basically locking itself to that original shape. Now, imagine that we had a character, and that character had, whatever, like a big floppy arm or something, or a tentacle or whatever. We could have the character's arm be animated perfectly, and then use nCloth on that arm, and then it'll give it kind of like a jittery movement to it. So it's not perfectly lined up. So this is usually something you would use for something that's been animated already, and then you're adding it on top of that to give it a little bit of jitter. All right, so it's very cool how we can do that kind of thing. Turn that back off. It has mass, just like our other ones, lifting, and some of these I never play with, so just to see, yeah. All right, drag, damp. Damping is going to be one of those important ones that helps bring our object to rest. Sometimes these dynamic objects will literally just keep moving forever. Okay, they'll never come to rest. So we add a little bit of damping in there, and what that's going to do is gradually make them come to rest. Okay, a little bit more gradual. 0.1. There we go. So you can see at the end of this, it actually stopped moving, which is an important thing because sometimes you'll see, you know, the shirt, even though his gut isn't moving, the shirt's still kind of wiggling around because there's not enough damping on there, okay? Now the other thing can be true, we can have too much damping on the object, and as the character's like walking, the dynamics for this part of the shirt aren't really there. So it's like it goes up and kind of hangs instead of falling down correctly. Or if you had a skirt on or a dress on, obviously that would come into play even more.
Is there rigidity with nCloth?
There is. I was looking for it right there, rigidity. Okay, so I passed it up, but here's rigidity. So we can also make this a rigid object. So now we're getting more of that bouncing instead of it just like hitting the ground. Now this is a fun one too. If I scroll down to, restitution, let me do that. Rigidity. All right, so I'm going to set this to 0.25. Okay, and you can see how it kind of bounces and wiggles a little bit. I'm going to drop another object on top of it. So this is one of the cool things about nCloth is that I can just make another nCloth object, make this one rigid, like that, and then this one's just going to fall right on top of it. Okay, so now they're like interacting with each other. Very cool. But let's say that I didn't want it to pop back out. I want it to hit and stay like it was. So if I'm remembering correctly, that's restitution. If I turn this down and hit play, that might be not far down enough.
Wow.
Nope.
That is cool.
I didn't do anything. Turn both of those down. Nope. Deform resistance is there, rigidity is there. Oops, I'm going the wrong one, that's why. There we go. Yes, you can.
Do you think they use nCloth to make like Hero 6? I'm trying to think of the guys that one.
Hero? Yeah. Well, they may not use nCloth, but they probably use some iteration of their own type of thing. Come on. So close. Doesn't want to play nice. Am I missing something else? Damping is up. That's good. Let me just take that all the way down. There we go. There's a delicate line there that I haven't quite hit. And it might even be like 0.1 and 0.1. But you can see now it's kind of holding that shape a little bit more when it hits. Now you could also use this, I've seen it used before, not in this exact look, but like if a car were to hit something and you wanted that impact to stay and locked in, that's where you could do it. So you could have like two objects that are very hard hit each other and cause that impact, cause that denting and that crimping. It's just that's not functioning correctly. Let me just see if that's 180. No, it's not. It's close, but it's not there yet. Yes, sir.
What if an object hit it and tore it, like tore a little piece off?
I'm not on tearing yet. We'll get to that. We will tear this surface up. All right. Okay. So you can see it kind of dented the surface a bit and gave it a little bit more than just being like that. All right.
But if you don't want it to dent the surface, is there elasticity to that?
Yeah, well, that's what I was doing with that restitution.
Is that what that restitution is?
Yeah. So having that up, I don't think it's that. I know.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. So it'll just bounce right back to where it was. But one of those guys at the right setting will lock it in so it doesn't do exactly, like it'll dent in and stay dent in like it's a sheet metal or something. All right, so going down here, there's a bunch of other stuff, dynamic property maps. This is where like Hollywood does their magic, because every object is not going to be like uniformly rigid or uniformly squishy or bouncy or stretchy or whatever else. So here is where we would paint a map. So just like you would paint a texture map, you would paint quality maps for your nCloth. So if you were to take this object into Mari and you painted on, let's say this is a pair of pants, you painted denim in that pair of pants, the seam for the denim is usually a lot more rigid, a lot tougher than the other materials of it, okay? Just because a seam usually has a bunch of denim kind of overlapping and tucked on top of itself. So in there you would paint things like a bend map saying that this area is not very bendable, but the front of the pants are very bendable because there is no seam there. The material is very loose and so on, okay? For what we're doing, we're keeping it very simple. This process, you could spend a whole week getting the character's clothing to look exactly like clothing. So don't be surprised if your stuff doesn't look exactly like a pair of denim pants. We're gonna go with more of like a doctor's type pants, very loose and kind of casual. But they have all of these. There's drag maps, there's wrinkle maps. You can actually wrinkle the clothing. Force field generation. I don't need to play the force field generation. Wind field generation. All right, here's pressure, and this is a cool one. So with pressure, I'm going to go to the volume tracking, and I'm just going to hit play, and we'll see. We'll probably get the same results. Yep, same results. Okay. So I need this to be a lot less rigid so that it'll actually compress. Rigidity. There we go. Alright, so now it's going to compress, so when I hit play, it falls down into just like it had before. Or it should have. What else did I turn up? Oh, my restitution's at 360. That should be fine. Bend resistance. There we go. I've resisted a bunch of stuff. I gotta unresist. There we go. So now it should be a little bit more droopy. 10. Alright. So now it's definitely a lot droopier. Okay. So I'm going to go to air tightness, and I can pull this down here. And you'll see how it just basically collapses on itself. I need more frames. Okay, because there's no air tightness, there's actually a hole somewhere in this container. So then I can start to add some pressure to it. Oops, I want to keep that at 0. I'm going to go to my pump rate and start to pump air into this. And you can see, I need more frames. There we go. And you can see how it's actually starting to fill up. There's actually air, digital air, being pumped into this thing a bit. So let's add a little bit more.
Is that what we're going to be breathing in the future?
Yes, digital air. Just like in that movie. There it is. Okay, let's keep going. Let's go to 10. And then... So now there's actually, like I said, air being pumped into this that's filling it up, which is pretty cool, because again, we could have this at 0, let it collapse on itself and flatten out, and then crank it up to like 60. Boom, and there goes the ball.
I had a question. Go back to the line. Let's see if we can. It sinks before it hits.
Right, because it's all of its resistances are down, so it's just gradually lowering itself in there. The ball just kind of helps it get down further. And then just pumping that in there. Okay. So, lots of stuff that you can do with this, and there's actually, if you go to YouTube and you type in nCloth and you watch these videos, one of them is like a bounce house that blows up, and then it's kind of bouncy. One of them is like this cellophane Mickey Mouse balloon, or not cellophane, what is it? Mylar. One of those Mylar Mickey Mouse balloons, and it pops up, and it's very cool. So there's a lot of neat stuff that you can do with just nCloth besides clothing itself. Let's delete that. Let's delete this. Let's make a new scene. So now let's go to some of the other options that we can play with. One of the biggest things with nCloth is that we want to have uniformity, okay? So right now, everything on this plane is perfectly square. Once I start scaling it, these are no longer square, they're rectangle, okay? So what that means is that in order for my cloth to move, it's going to take these individual points and move them. And as it does, what's going to happen is I'm going to get rectangle movement. Okay, so it's not going to be nice square uniform movement. It's going to look like I have these like rectangles kind of moving. So you always want your stuff to be square. So I'm going to go to my width and just add enough divisions to make this square. Now you also have to keep in mind how many divisions you want to be simulated. Not how many you want the end result to have, but how many you want simulated. If this is a piece of silk, which has a lot of deformation, a lot of smoothness, a lot of wrinkles, this isn't going to cut it. I may have to go like crazy on this and have like 100. I may have to have something like that in order for silk to read like silk. Now let's say it's burlap. I don't need that many for burlap because burlap is chunkier and doesn't wrinkle as much as something like silk would do. Okay? So just for fun, I'm going to leave it like that. And I'm going to raise it up. And I'm going to rotate it just a bit like that. Okay. Actually, let's rotate it 90 degrees back to where it was. All right. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to make this an nCloth object. Let me hide all this stuff that Dylan likes to show. There we go. And if we hit play, of course, it's going to fall. Again, the more divisions we have, the longer it's going to take. Your hair should be turned off. Your hair should not be simming when you're playing with your clothing. All right, so it just falls down. So if I were to create an object under here, okay, this is going to be my colliding object, and he doesn't have to be square. He's just going to be a passive collider. He's not going to deform at all. So now as I hit play, he's going to fall down and drape over the top of him. It's a good idea to get kind of comfortable with the clothing before you start doing it, because you'll really see some of the stuff that's like, oh, you know, if this didn't have enough divisions, we wouldn't get these nice folds here. If I had 5 divisions by 5 divisions, it would look horrible. It would look like this blocky mass that just sits on top of it. But with this, I mean, I have this nice cloth. I'm getting some really nice wrinkles in there. I can see a little bit of artifacting. You can see how it looks kind of like faceted, but that's fine. I'm not looking at that stuff because when I'm ready, I can hit 3 and that'll smooth out all of those transitions. I'm also looking at like the thickness of this, saying, ooh, I don't want this to look that thin. I want this to be like an actual like millimeter thick or something, so it looks like a blanket, right? You don't sim stuff with that thickness. You sim stuff with the thickness of a piece of paper, and then we can extrude it. It's thinking. And then when we extrude it, then we can give it that thickness. 0.05. There we go. Okay, now that thickness didn't work, so I'm just going to use the arrow and pull the arrow. There we go. Okay. So now I'm getting the thickness. Now think back to your bullet. What happened when we added double the amount of bulleted objects? What did that do to the processing time?
It slowed it down extremely slow.
Slowed it down extremely slow. Okay. So if I were to try to sim this double-sided thing, it's going to slow this thing down, right? And I run the risk of it kind of going through that object at some point and making it look horrible. So we never do that. You sim the one side, so you have half the divisions, and then you just give it thickness at the end, and no one will know the difference. You can't tell that, you know, it's probably intersecting that sphere at some point, but we just can't tell. And it looks pretty good. If you look at the edges of that, it looks wonderful. And I could even add a bevel to this, which is really nice because even though it's calculating just that plane moving down, I can still modify stuff afterwards, and it doesn't destroy what I've created already. Okay? So I'm going to undo those steps there. There we go. So I think this is before I extruded. Yes, okay. So now let's say we wanted something different to happen here. Okay? What I want to do is I want to hold the edges of this and I want to drop something through my cloth. So I'm going to grab the vertices, and just like everything else in Maya, it's glitchy. Okay? So if we do more than one of these things, it becomes very glitchy. Look at that. Now I'm doing this in perspective just because I'm awesome. I can do it in perspective without grabbing stuff I don't want. All right, end constraint, transform. They reordered these for some reason, so just be careful when you're selecting these. Transform's the one I want. I think this is alphabetical order, yes. All right, so now when I hit play, what we're gonna see is we get this, okay? So we get this trampoline basically, where we get this little dip in there, and it's just sitting there doing nothing, okay? And if I were to create that original sphere that I made in the last one, or even a cube, no, let's make a sphere. Cubes run the risk of, again, falling through because they're cubes. There's no divisions in the middle, and that's what it's looking for to collide with. So let's make that an nCloth object. I'm going to turn its rigidity up. Rigidity, there we go. And so now when it hits, what's going to happen is it's going to hit and it's going to bounce. That's what we expect it to happen. Okay, so it's hitting, we're getting these nice ripples, and then it's bouncing. Now you can also think of your nCloth as something that maybe you don't want to use as an actual nCloth object, but you want to use that to create a base for something else. So if I'm trying to create like a tablecloth, it's a lot easier just to drop an nCloth on there and duplicate it and then have my nCloth tablecloth than to try to model an actual tablecloth that's fit. All right, so like I said, it falls down and then does nothing. It just kind of like goes bloop, and that's it. There it is. There's the bloop.
If you're going to do a flag, you just constrain one side of that?
Correct. If I was doing curtains, I would grab every other vertice and constrain every other vertice. That way I get a little bit of a droop in those curtains, right? So I'm going to grab random vertices here. Vertices? Edges. I'm grabbing random edges. Okay. Now I could do this a number of different ways. This is the way that I'm choosing to do this, which is just by holding shift and just marking like crazy until I have something like that. Now under end constraint, I'm going to make a terrible surface. Terrible surface, thank you. A terrible surface.
Pretty bad.
All right, now here's where it gets kind of sticky because I made the terrible surface, and when I made a terrible surface, my transform constraint is now off. It does it sometimes. So you can see I had this nice little seam here, and now it's no longer there. Now sometimes it's just display, whereas I hit play, it'll work correctly. Obviously in this case it's not working correctly. It's just falling apart.
They jumped.
They did. And there's something in the math with how it figures that out. But the easiest thing to do is just kind of go through and just remake it. Now sometimes it makes more sense to just do individual ones. So do one transform for this side, and I'll just do one transform for that side. I don't care about the middle in this case. There we go. Okay. So now I hit play. And again, more stuff that we add to the scene, the more bells and whistles, the longer it's going to take to calculate. But what we should get, I think it's going to hit the other ball and then just stay there. It is. Dang it. But look at that. It's ripping open. Okay. So what we have here is, remember how in Bullet, how we kept objects together? What did we use? What was that? Glue shapes. My other analogy was, remember in kindergarten when you had to put something on a piece of paper and get it to stick. So that's what we have to do. So on one of these, number 2 here, which is why I want to name these, glue, tear. Okay. So on my tear, somewhere in this big thing is glue strength. So the bigger my glue strength, the stronger this is. So obviously 0.5 will make this a lot stronger than 0.1. As I hit play, I let it go. Now the way that this terrible surface works is it actually separates each one of these faces into a separate piece and then does its stuff to it. So for some things it becomes very tricky to get it to look good, but it still can be a neat effect. Now here, it hit it. I don't know if it broke through. It does not break through. Okay, so I'm going to come to this object, and just like before, we're going to crank that mass up. Okay, more mass, heavier object, it should rip through. Now I don't want to see the tear pieces, so I'm just going to hide that. Okay, just hiding it lets me see the object without seeing all those little bits there. So close.
You ever blew up pretty high.
I do. It broke through. Look at that. See? I also must have my stretch resistance down really far too. There we go. There we go. Cool. Look at that. And that's what's neat about it, is we'll get these pieces that look like they're pretty good from far away. Now the bad thing is that you get pieces, if we're up close, that look like squares. Okay? If I smooth it, it'll look like round squares. Like that. So it doesn't look very fancy. Now, like I said before, we want to keep everything square. We don't need to if we're going to make it a terrible surface. Okay? Because typically you're not going to have something nice and smooth that is a terrible surface. Usually it's something like an old pirate flag that's, you know, already worn and tore up or whatever. So for something like that, I would actually sculpt the surface a little bit and add crazy divisions all over the place that are at a different crazy angle. And that will allow us to create these nice little patterns in there, okay, that make it look like it's actually torn and not just like cut out. Okay. Now again, you could use something like that. I could just duplicate that and scoot that over, and now I have whatever that would be in my scene. I don't know what that would be. I think someone was asking about one of their assignments. How do I make glue, or like, he's not here today. How do I make yeah, a goo on one of his wires? Because he was doing Iron Man. Yeah, my Jordan's not here. It's not his class. I just right. So again, so it's a kind of a cool thing that we can do for stuff like that. Now again, all of this stuff can be animated. Okay, so even though I've set certain things, like I've locked these edges in there and I've locked my terrible surface on there, all of those things can be animated as well. All I'd have to do is animate this enable and then tell it to go away. So just for fun, let's see what's going to happen there. And you'll see the entire thing just falls apart, because all of those little faces that it duplicates and is just held together by that glue are now falling apart. That terrible surface is no longer valid. Okay, and then those side pieces are also no longer valid. Now I've done before with nCloth, just nCloth, I've actually made a hot air balloon, and the hot air balloon actually lifted objects up, and it was holding a basket with strings, and the basket and the strings were all connected. And then at one point I could detach those, and then the whole thing would fall down. It was pretty cool. It was a lot of setup, a lot of trial and error, a lot of playing around, but eventually it worked, okay, because stuff like that takes time. There's no like hot air balloon button. All right, let me make another new scene. All right, now the last little piece I'm going to show, and I'm going to make a little cube. There we go, there we go. Okay, so this is going to be my nCloth. This is going to be my passive collider. We can guess what's going to happen here. It's just going to kind of sag off the side of it. Now, nCloth, like I said, is not just cloth. It could be lots of different things. Under the presets, we get a lot of different things. So one of them that is awesome to watch, if you're bored, is putty. So putty just does that. And that would actually do exactly what I wanted to do before, which is if something hits it, it's going to stay in that shape. The other one is lava. So here's lava. Now this one will go bloop.
It's all the same.
It's not all the same. It's not the same. Why would they have so many presets if they were all the same?
No, I'm just joking.
Lava is going to move very slowly, right? So what's going to happen is it's going to gradually just kind of like grow and deform. Even though it's not particles, even though it's not something along there which you would think like a liquid, this could still be simulated to represent kind of like a liquid. Kind of like this like blobby mass rolling down something. And then let's see what else we have here. There's a couple of them that are really fun to watch. There's a water balloon.
Now, can you tear that?
You can still tear it. Honey is a good one too. Oops. And this is kind of like faster versions of lava. But again, you can see how it's just kind of like dragging down and drooping. Again, something you could add to your scene, just something in the background to make it look nice. Oh. I don't want it to drop, so I have to make a cup to hold it. What do you mean? Having the cloth move but not the object?
Is it like having wind or something?
Yes, there's wind and gravity on it. That's all under the nucleus. It's going, it's just, you know, honey.
You know, honey.
You know, honey. Let's scoot this over a little bit.
So you paint the horse's butt.
2 years ago, during one of the bad snowstorms, they had on the news, they showed this huge truck that's responsible for like transporting all the snow that they piled into it. And it basically just transports the snow and then it dumps it somewhere. So for like a minute and a half on the news, they had this truck lifted up like this and this huge pack of snow just waiting to drop off. And I was glued to the TV. That's what this is. All right, that's cool. So there we go. So you can see how it's going into there. And again, it's not a liquid, but it's acting very similar to a liquid. And again, the more stuff we kind of play with, it's going through. We won't watch it again. Because I didn't rewind, it didn't register that that was an end passive object, whatever. I can make that whole process sped up a little bit just by taking my resistances down. There we go. Oops, there's probably got some damping and drag on here. Yes, it does. See? Just turn those off. There we go. And now it's actually hitting the side and collecting in the cup. Now, just like everything else, there's a collision thickness too. So, if my object is kind of floating above the surface, I can adjust my collision thickness to make it fall into the surface. And this will go on forever. Because it doesn't have any of these resistances, it's literally just stretching those points further and further apart. Let me go to my nucleus and I'll kick up some wind. Wind speed, 10. And we'll have it go in the X direction. It's doing something. Yeah, those points are just pulling them off, just very barely. And I could smooth that, obviously. Okay. Now for this too, if I wanted this to not look like that where it's cutting through the box should be more refined. It should be closer to the actual shape that I want that box to hit. So obviously I need to shape that a little bit more. Here, it's fine because we can't really see it. But here, oops, here we are seeing that. All right. And then just like everything else, we do it in stages. So for the nCloth assignment, we're doing a shirt and pants. So we're going to do one of those. I believe we do the pants first. Let it sim out. Calculate what the pants are going to look like. Tweak it until you're happy with the results of it. And then we're locking it in and doing a cache. Then we're going to do the shirt. Same way, okay? So don't try to do shirt and pants at the same time because you're going to be fighting two different things happening. With what we're doing, the shirt's actually not really an issue of needing to collide with the pants and interact with it. The pants do its thing, the shirt does its thing. As long as the shirt doesn't go through the pants, we're good, okay? Yeah, so that should be it. We have caches just like before, a bunch of cache things just like we've had before. All of these fields we could use too, not that we need them for this assignment, but they're available, okay? So far we've used gravity because it's been built in, but we can add more gravity. We can actually create different things. Not there. Particles. Particles are cool because you can really see the stuff happen. Particle grid, particle tool, there it is. Nope. Create options, points, yes. And particle tool, yes. There we go. Okay, so I want to make a particle grid, 0.5, sure. There, enter. All right. So these are particles. Now these fields that are here, there's gravity just like before. So they'll fall down with gravity. But what the fields have that just the overall gravity thing doesn't have, that you may want to play with at some point, is a volume control attribute. All those have pretty much the same feature or same tools. It's just the matter of which one it is. So gravity has this here. So I can make this sphere, make this bigger, and now that sphere is only affecting, or the particles are only affected by what's in the sphere. So when I rewind it and hit play, I have to also turn off the gravity on the nucleus because that's pulling it down also. Nucleus, gravity, 0. There we go. So now just that part there is going to fall off and be affected by gravity. So it doesn't really, why would I want that to happen? Well, sometimes we do. Sometimes we have certain areas where we want something here to be turbulent or to have noise or to have gravity, maybe even not just to have it, but it has more of it. Like maybe at the beginning of our scene, our character's clothes are going crazy, so we just need to add some gravity to pull it down or some damping to pull it down a little bit. Or let's say the hair. We don't need the hair to be turbulent all over the place, but at the beginning we want the hair to have some turbulence, okay, just to kind of mess it up. And then as we move along, then there's no more turbulence. So all of these fields that are up here have that ability to create a volume, okay? And you can do two kinds. One, everything inside the volume is affected. Two, everything outside the volume is affected. And they just call that volume exclusion right there. So you just turn that on, turn it off, whatever. So those are those guys. We don't need to worry about that. Here's more of those painting property things. So if we were to paint things like glue strength, weighting, strength of different things, depending on what I have selected, it would show different stuff there. We'd be able to do that. Also here's some nCloth painting things that we could paint if we were to paint things inside of Maya. And what else? Yeah, that's it. There is nCloth examples. I think that these are still loaded, meaning we don't have to go to the website and download them and then try to play with them. So their examples that they have are a bag of marbles. It's a random thing. But these are actually an nCloth object with particles inside. nParticles and nCloth work together. Okay? So I can actually have cloth and particles colliding with each other. Here's basic clothing. This guy here in shorts, curtain rail, flag waving, a slinky, nCloth water, paper airplanes, a zipper. This is actually pretty cool if you ever get a chance to do something outside of just what we do in class. The zipper one is cool because you actually build a zipper that zips. So you have your nCloth that's a terrible surface, basically, and then you have this zipper, and as the zipper moves up, it tightens up the cloth. It basically sews it back together, which is pretty neat. And then you pull the zipper down, and then it loosens that glue strength. It's really cool. There's that thick slab. And then leaves too. So if you had a tree with a bunch of leaves in it, and you wanted the tree to be kind of soft, you can make that an nCloth object so it kind of wiggles around. And then you could have the leaves, all the leaves also be nCloth, and also be held on by kind of like a glue that eventually blows away and it flies away. There's confetti, which is pretty cool too. Party streamers. Again, cool stuff. Again, you want to use it in moderation. You don't want to use all of those in one scene at the same time. We'll let